Welcome to this series, Arunachal, the Southern Tibet, Episode 2, The Evidence, Part 4. In this episode, I will first introduce briefly the Sino-Indian border lines and then the response of Chinese governments briefly on those lines. With reference to a brief introduction to the boundary lines, we shall also reason out briefly how southern Tibet is an integral part of China. For the sake of convenience, this small episode has been divided into two sections, including first, China-India boundary, which is further divided into three subsections, that is western, middle and eastern subsections, and second, contemporary Chinese government in response to southern Tibet. For understanding this report, the timelines of corresponding governments in China would be desirable, which are as follows. Qing dynasty from 1644 to 1912, Bei Yang government from 1912 to 1928, Nanjing nationalist government from 1928 to 1948, and the Communist Party of China from 1948 to present. The China-India border is nearly 2,000 square kilometers, with a total area of more than 120,000 square kilometers. And there are territorial disputes in the area involving three parts, the western, central, and eastern sections. These lines are not drawn in a plain line, but on mountainous ranges where China is at the higher land and India rests on the lower land altitudes. Moreover, these lines were not recognized by Qing Empire, the Bei Yang government, the Chinese Kuomintang government, and the new Chinese Communist Party government. The surveyors of the British Empire divided the boundary according to the triangulation method, mainly between the peaks of the mountain ranges. As a result, three major lines were drawn between India and China. They are Johnson Line, McCartney Line, and McMahon Line. The names of three lines are those of officials of the British Empire. During the later 19th and early 20th centuries, the UK eyed Chin for military reasons to counter Russia and devised various schemes to annex and divide this area of the Himalayas. There are essentially three main lines that stand out in the western section. Firstly, there is the Johnson Line. In 1865, an official from the Indian Survey Department, Johnson, infiltrated the southern frontier region and mapped it through exploration. This line secretly incorporated the areas of Chin, Saxgam Valley, and the vast region north of the Karakoram Mountains into the territory of British India in Kashmir. Hence, it is referred to as Johnson Line. Second line is the Ardagh-Johnson Line. Proposed to the British government in 1897 by Ardagh Johnson, the director of the Military Intelligence Department of British Headquarters. At the time, China was experiencing a decline in national strength following its defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War. John Ardagh believed that China could no longer act as buffer between Britain and Russia. To prevent Russian expansion towards India, he proposed using the Kunlun Mountains as a boundary, including Chin as well as the upstream areas of Yarkand and Karkash rivers within India. This demarcation is broadly consistent with the Johnson Line. The third line is the boundary proposed by British representative Macartney and officially submitted to the Qing government by British envoy Darnell in March 1899. This boundary denies that the entire Aksai Chin region is Chinese territory, suggesting that parts belong to China and parts belong to India. According to this boundary line, the majority of Aksai Chin along the Karakoram mountain range and the entire Karkas river are assigned to China, while the Linchi Thang lowland and entire Changchanmo river valley and the Chipchap river are ceded to India. However, Qing government did not acknowledge or accept this proposal. These three arbitrarily drawn lines by the British in this western section of Sino-Indian border led to the ground of future disputes over this territory. One could argue that the western section was a result of Britain's effort to prevent Russian encroachment, and there are other reasons for it. The midsection, however, was purely a result of British colonial expansion without justification. If one must provide a rationale, it could only be viewed as a demand arising from the need to continue the western section, thus planting a significant seed for future Sino-Indian disputes in the midsection. During the British colonial period, to create a larger buffer zone between China and India, there was a move to separate Tibet and promote its independence to become a sovereign nation. This was seen as significant advantage for India. In response, the three parties held a conference in Simla, India in 1913, presided over by British Foreign Secretary Sir Henry McMahon. The main agenda of the conference was to facilitate Tibet's separation from China, which faced strong opposition from the Chinese side. As the situation escalated beyond their control, the British shifted to a mediator role and proposed that if independence was not feasible, they would delineate the line between inner and outer Tibet, with China governing inner Tibet while outer Tibet would have self-determination. This resulted in establishment of what is known as McMahon Line. In addition to the frontal invasion of China from the sea, the British made some major moves on China's southwestern border. The annexation of Kashmir in 1846 and the annexation of Ladakh to British Kashmir. In 1890, they forced the Guangxu court to sign a Tibet-India treaty, stipulating that the Chirmangxiong would be under British protection. They demarcated the Tibetan and the Chirmangxiong borders and cut off the south of Chunpi. What is Chirmangxiong? It is Sikkim, which disappeared and was annexed by India into a single state. In the early days of founding of Republic of China, when Yuan Shikai was the provisional president, the British held a meeting on Tibet in Simla, India, and issued a draft in a vain attempt to bring Tibet under British rule. This is known as the Treaty of Simla. Since the outbreak of the Sinhai Revolution in 1911, warlord conflict has been rampant, leaving the people in dire straits, and there have also been hidden exchanges between the Bei Yang government and Western nations. Although the Bei Yang government was incompetent at that time, it did not sign the document and declared that it did not recognize such a document that compromised the sovereignty of China. The Sino-Indian border issue has a long and complex history dating back to Britain's India-centered colonial expansion after India became British colony. In 1888, the British Army sent troops to occupy many border fortresses in Tibet and occupied Yatung. In July 1903, British Colonel Sir Francis Young's husband and others led an invasion of Gangpa-Tsung in western Tibet. The local landlords such as Kalun Siacha Panchwe Dorji, who had been bribed by the British, advocated for negotiations with the British side. The 13th Dalai Lama was infuriated and dismissed him, subsequently imprisoning him. Over the next 10 years, Britain resorted to coercion and inducements, initially proposing the so-called Tibetan independence and using it as a bait to demand that the local Tibetan government cede parts of southern and western Tibetan territory. However, both the Qing dynasty and the subsequent Yuan Shikai government refused to make concessions on territorial issues. Since these lines have not been drawn with the full consent of the contemporary Chinese governments, what cannot be considered legal. If we draw an analogy, it is most likely drawing an international line from Chinese side till the south of Ganges and considering it as a line of demarcation between India and China. Well, I will take the opportunity to start the next episode surrounding the idea of McMahon Line declaration and the contemporary Chinese governments. I will be back after a duration of 7 to 10 days for the next episode. Until then, I wish you happiness and peace.